Welcome to the Lorecast, where we look into the lore and the stories by which we live. I'm Dr. Craig Chalquist, and you can find us at chalquist.com/podcast and at a number of other online venues. What a funny thing the touch is, the brush stroke. Out of doors, exposed to the wind, the sun, people's curiosity. One works as one can, one fills one's canvas regardless. Yet then, one catches the true and the essential. That's the most difficult thing. Vincent van Gogh. We're going to look at Van Gogh's life and creative process to get a sense of the relationship between genius, madness, and creativity. And let me apologize up front to the Dutch members of the audience for mispronouncing Van Gogh's name. I know that in Dutch, his last name is pronounced something more like Van Gogh. So I'll say that up front. But I'm going to go ahead and go by the American pronunciation. It's familiar even though it's wrong. And let me say this up front before I forget. On a related note, if you're interested in a course, an online course on young symbol and creativity, that's the name of it. I've got one at chalquist.com. If you go to the course tab and scroll down a little bit, I taught that course in graduate school, and then I turned the syllabus into an outline, kept the audio recordings, packaged it up for sale at my website. So gets really far into the depth psychology of creativity. So Van Gogh, most of us know a little bit about him, a Dutch artist. He was born in the Netherlands in 1853. He died in France in 1890. He killed himself. There was a theory for a while that he was shot by a teenager, but it's since been disproven with a lot of homework. And in between that time, Van Gogh, he functioned as an artist, but not for most of his life. He was very creative right from the beginning of his life. And when he was, I think, 9, he was already sketching. So he's an example of someone who had the artistic calling from early on, but for various reasons couldn't hear it clearly until he got a little bit older. So effectively, maybe 8, 9 years, that's when his most productive period happened. So all those great works of art that we know him for, most of them happened then, not all of them. Probably his earliest great masterpiece was The Potato Eaters. He was always keen to portray the life of people who society tended to discount, partially because he identified with them. And so you'll see in his works peasants and farmers and coal miners and others. Van Gogh was broke for most of his life, and he was financially supported by his brother Theo, who was an art dealer, a successful one. And so they had a bit of a trade going where Van Gogh would send him what are now multi-million-dollar masterpieces, and then Theo would help him pay the rent. So that was their arrangement for many years. At the time Van Gogh was painting, his work was considered fairly radical. He was fond of Impressionism, as it's now known. So if you think about the works of Monet, for instance, and Impressionists used color to put together some naturalistic images, impressions of landscapes, countrysides, Monet's lily pond, things like that. And Van Gogh, as much as he admired some of the work of the Impressionists, didn't really consider himself one. He's now known as a post-impressionist, which has to do with a group of other artists, including Gogh and Seurat and some others, Cézanne, who it's almost as though they deepened Impressionism by really bringing in the subjective factor strongly. So when you look at Van Gogh's Starry Night, which he actually painted while he was in an asylum, the stars don't look natural at all. They're not impressionistically painted at all. They look like the impact somebody who loves the sky would would have as he painted, and that's what Van Gogh did. So we see the world differently through Van Gogh's paintings. They really emphasize color and not just impressions, but each one is a kind of world. You look at peasants or shoes or wheat or sunflowers or whatever, and they're worlds. They're not just objects that he painted. Now, there's been a lot of debate about what mental illness Van Gogh actually suffered from. He had lots of different symptoms. He was diagnosed in his own lifetime with epilepsy. He came from a family with a history of mental illness. In fact, his one of his uncles, one of his sisters, both suicides. He eventually would take his own life. And so there was a lot of what used to be called melancholy, now we would say depression, running in his family. But in Van Gogh's case, it alternated with what looks a lot like mania. And so lots of back and forth among people analyzing his letters and trying to figure out what he had. If I could weigh in, I've known several people who suffered from bipolar disorder, and one up close. And fortunately, I've never suffered from it, but I have seen it in action. And when I read his letters, I see bipolar disorder all over the place in them. And they don't usually rant, they're not crazy. And I'm thinking of the collection, which I want to recommend, called Van Gogh, A Life in Letters. You can actually read all of his letters that have been preserved, but it makes really heavy going. The Life in Letters is a nice selection to different people. Most of them are to his brother Theo, but they're quite candid. They're funny in places. The excerpt I read at the beginning comes from that collection. And what I'm seeing with Van Gogh, not just in terms of his symptoms, but the way he writes. He, of course, had that episode, that psychotic episode where he cut off his entire ear, gave it to a cleaning woman at a brothel, and was hospitalized. And afterwards, not long afterwards, he's already talking to Theo about, well, it would be nice to have another go at the Yellow House and create an artist colony and this and that. And this kind of unrealistic optimism is a hallmark of a manic phase. You hear it a lot in people who are bipolar. They think they can do anything. And also massive projections onto other people. So a lot of what he says to Theo about, is your health okay? Are you this? Are you that? He's really talking about himself. It's clear in retrospect. So I'm emphasizing this up front because I'm trying to counter one extreme approach to looking at this relationship between genius and madness, and the extreme is to romanticize madness. To say that people who suffer from major mental disorders like bipolar or other mood disorders or schizophrenia or what have you are actually operating on a higher plane than the rest of us, they're spiritually enlightened beings and so forth, when the on the ground reality is that they're thoroughly miserable. They say so. Afterwards, they say, "Oh, those delusions and hallucinations, they were just devastating. I was terrified the whole time I was having them." And it's a miserable way to live unless there's some kind of support, which Van Gogh had very little of, actually. He did pretty well when he was in the hospital and in the asylum after, because he was treated kindly. And he was allowed to paint, which is the main thing he wanted to do. And he made some of his best work then. But we shouldn't romanticize mental illness. And there may be some truth that severely mentally ill people do have some kind of an unusually wide permeability to archetypal forces or archetypal, what's a good way of saying it? Realms of experience, let's put it that way. But for that reason, we shouldn't think that they're having a blissful life. Van Gogh certainly didn't. And he would mention to Theo that especially after that particularly bad episode, he was afraid he was going to have others, which actually happened. One of the saddest things about the timing of that episode, it happened in 1889, so not all that long before he died, before he killed himself. But he felt like he was doing really well. He was starting to get noticed professionally just a little bit, thanks to his brother. And he was living in the yellow house, which he then painted, and he was living with Gauguin, the other painter, who he had talked to a lot about forming a sort of artist colony of people who were down and out and wanted to do art because they weren't supported by the state or by anybody, basically. So all of that fell through. Gauguin moved out. He was terrified by what happened, understandably. And the neighbors got together and petitioned for Van Gogh to be booted out of his house, which he then was. Very sad. And we can't help wondering what might have happened if he had had more support, a whole network of people who understood what he was going through and were there for him. I think it would have turned out very differently. The other extreme that's fairly common is to say that the mental illness that these people have somehow explains the art, that the art or other creative works, stories, or whatever it is, are somehow reducible to mental illness, which of course is nonsense. Um, the illness definitely colors the production, but usually it gets in the way more than it helps. So we're not going to understand the productions of creative genius by reducing them to psychopathology. That has never worked. It never will work. It's an approach that never should have got started, and we should abandon it. Van Gogh created masterpieces not because he was mad or bipolar or anything else like that, but because he was a great painter who created masterpieces. We should perhaps consider too the time that he lived in collectively, especially in Europe. And again, his work, his process is not reducible to this. But there was a lot in the collective unconscious happening at that time. Remember that Europe was starting to gear up toward a world war, which of course would break out in 1914. In 1900, Freud published his famous work, The Interpretation of Dreams, which inaugurated depth psychology and psychoanalysis. A few years before that, with Joseph Breuer, he published Studies in Hysteria. And then a bit before that, French doctors were experimenting with hypnosis. There was a lot of psychic work going on, people who were like Anton Mesmer, who were claiming to have arcane powers. Theosophy was popular in some ways, if we define it pretty broadly as interest in the esoteric. So there was really a lot in the air going on, and the Enlightenment was getting ready to shatter under the weight of not just one but two world wars. So sensitive people picked up on some of this. They picked up on the underside of the collective shadow of what was being denied consciousness, particularly European consciousness. And so some of this, I think, comes out thematically in Van Gogh's paintings, especially the ones that focus on industrial workers who were being brutally exploited and who gave their lives so that the machine could move forward. What we can say, I think, about the relationship between genius and madness, or if madness is too extreme, let's say mental illness or symptoms or what have you, I think we can say that by and large, people with gifts of different kinds, not just painters, but other kinds of gifts, creative gifts, tend to be more sensitive than others. And so when there's a lot of shadow or hypocrisy or underground movement in action, they tend to register it before anybody else does. And it's a lonely experience because they can feel and not always articulate that something important is happening, but they remain misunderstood because most people have no sense of what's going on. So it's important for the gifted and the sensitive to do what people like Van Gogh or Nietzsche comes to mind failed to do and were broken by, namely to put aside some of their isolation and be able to reach out to others and get support by people who either understand their sensitivity or at least respect it. And as for the formula that excessive genius leads to madness, I think we've just explained it. And we should add, too, that when psychological studies of gifted populations are done, they're generally people who are happier and more social than the rest of us. So that tends to discount the notion, too. I've often thought that People who have the attitude, well, if you have so much genius, then you must be crazy. I think that that's a projection. I think that they haven't come to terms with their own dark places. But additionally, I also think it's a form of envy. It's a form of disparaging somebody else's gifts and talents. And I'm no Van Gogh, and I'm not even a painter, but I've seen many examples of this in my own life, in modest amounts. And one that comes to mind, I had an eighth grade teacher who gave me a test, and by that time I had a pretty good ear for language, and especially as it appeared on paper and writing. And so I ended up being the only student who ever passed her very difficult test on where to place commas. And she immediately and baselessly accused me of cheating. And she made the mistake of going to my parents, who then appropriately shamed her and said, "You have no idea who you're dealing with." So that was nice. One of the times that they stood up for me when that happened. I think her action was prompted by anxiety, maybe fear, and like I mentioned, envy. You can always tell teachers who shouldn't be teaching because they discount the abilities of their students instead of being glad to be surpassed, which should be the joy of every teacher. And I have been fortunate enough to have several teachers who were like that and who encouraged me without any tinge of envy or disparagement. Quite the contrary. It's often been said of Van Gogh that he was his own worst enemy, and that's true in some ways, but if he really did have bipolar disorder, and he certainly was psychotic at least part of the time, it's not really fair to say that because when it's that biological, it's not really under the control of the person who's suffering from it. So, that I read as another symptom of mania where, it says he liked to argue with people, he was inappropriately opinionated. He would make comments about people's work that weren't solicited. He would fight with people when there was just no need to do that. Those are manic symptoms. And they got in his way. They didn't improve his creativity. They kept him from opportunities that would have enriched his professional life and his relational life, too. When he was in artist academies, he stayed for a while and he learned a lot, but he always left because of differences of opinion. And it never seems to have occurred to him to make use of what he got without being enslaved by it. It did occur to him to do that with regard to technique. So, in letters to other artists, he writes about how you have to master the basics, you have to get the technique down. But he so readily felt like people were putting him in boxes that he reacted to it very sharply. And it really didn't serve him. And during his saner moments, he would regret his own behavior, but I really don't think it was under his control. I think one of the great tragedies of Van Gogh is that because he had what looked like manic episodes, he didn't have full charge of how he showed up in the world. I remember some years ago talking to someone a fellow student actually, who I didn't realize had bipolar disorder. And at one point, she started getting more and more heated about just some intellectual point that she was making. And I would say things like, well, yes, I get where you're coming from. I certainly understand that. And do you think that this over here is a possibility too? No, there's no possibility of that. That's completely out of the question. And so there was this pressure to be right. And although many people suffer from the pressure to be right, as a former clinician, there's a feeling that you get sometimes that I got, which is this is starting to feel biological. This is starting to feel like this person can't really control what they're doing, That level of resistance, So I think that was the case with him too, and it shows up in his letters as well. For the last year or so of Van Gogh's life, he was under a tremendous pressure to create, and sometimes that's attributed to mania, but I don't think they're directly related. I think that what Van Gogh sensed was the end coming, and in fact, in a letter to another artist, he mentioned that he had a nightmare one night, or actually two of them, and one of them was about a short story called The Horla by Maupassant. And in this story, There's a man, the protagonist of the story, who has an encounter with a sailing vessel that's carrying an extraterrestrial who's dangerous and who then starts possessing people. And in this story, the protagonist ends up killing himself. And that was one nightmare. The other nightmare was of the Flying Dutchman. Van Gogh refers to it in his letters as the Dutch ghost ship. So I think he sensed the end coming. Um, there was also, during one of his bouts of mania or madness, there was a song that he was singing, even though he thought he couldn't sing, but he was singing a lullaby that a mother might sing, and she appeared in one of his last paintings. In fact, he recommended that she be in the center of a triptych involving three of his paintings, two of which were sunflower paintings. And it's almost as though, if we said it in Jungian, it's almost as though the archetype of the Great Mother showed up to comfort him on his way out. Be that as it may, he had premonitions of death. He mentioned suicide in his letters, in other connections, not in terms of he wanting to do it. In fact, when he wrote to Theo after his really bad attack, he mentioned that he was regaining his strength, he was eating better, sleeping better, drinking less, things like that. One letter that he wrote that really should have got the attention of his family and the doctors was he briefly mentions his anger at being cast out of the house after the ear cutting episode. And he says something like, if I had been less of a coward, I would have defended myself with a revolver, and shooting a couple of bystanders, when done by an artist, probably wouldn't have convicted me. And so that really should have been a red flag right there. It's too bad it wasn't. These days, a competent therapist or doctor would immediately check out whether he owned a revolver and tried to find a way to separate him from the weapon. But of course, that didn't happen. And in 1890, he was out in a wheat field near the asylum. He was painting in broad daylight, which he loved to do, and he shot himself. And that was the end. And of course, the sad old capitalistic story where after he died, his work was recognized as being the work of genius, and now it sells for millions of dollars. The last painting that he gave us, by the way, which has been called Tree Roots, shows the tangled undergrowth of trees, which is perhaps appropriate in this connection. His highest price painting, by the way, was of his doctor, and it sold in 1990 for $83 million. It's now been estimated to be worth $152 million. Another tragedy of Van Gogh's life is that he didn't promote his own work. He didn't really even show it much, just once or twice. And he received feedback from other artists that it was brilliant and it needed to be shown. His own brother showed it, but he had this ambivalent attitude that I often see in creative people who, they come up with something that they're good at and then they don't want to promote it. And what you often hear is, I don't like promoting myself, right? And Van Gogh was really actually a humble man. I think the opinionated part was his mania talking. But when you read his letters about his reflections on his own work, he's always saying things like, I have so much more to learn, and isn't Gauguin brilliant, and Monet and others, and he was always very willing and open to learning new things because he felt like the learning was perpetual. And he never called himself a master of any kind. He doesn't seem to have realized that he was one. And so I think part of what he didn't realize was that promoting your work and promoting you are two separate things. And it's not about promoting you. It's about the work, right? I don't know how many times I've told my students when they write something brilliant, you have an obligation to get this into the world. This isn't about you anymore. This is bigger than you. This is a message that people really need to hear, and you need to be thinking about them and the message. I think part of Van Gogh's greatness, too, is that he managed to keep his sense of humor. His letters are actually quite amusing sometimes. In one of them, he talks about how does he put it, that painting and fucking a lot don't go together, unfortunately. So its humor is very earthy and pops up now and then. So he kept a sense of humor in spite of all the tragedy. And in spite of all of it, he taught us a new way to see. Let me read you something about how he saw a particular scene. Now, the first tree is an enormous trunk, but struck by lightning and sawn off. A side branch thrusts up very high, however, and falls down again in an avalanche of dark green twigs. This dark giant, like a proud man brought low, contrasts, when seen as the character of a living being, with the pale smile of the last rose on the bush, which is fading in front of him. Under the trees, empty stone benches, dark box. The sky is reflected yellow in a puddle after the rain. A ray of sun, the last glimmer, exalts the dark ochre to orange. Small dark figures prowl here and there between the trunks. When you look at the peach trees he left us, the olive trees, the people, the wheat, the sunflowers, they radiate presence. It's almost impossible, maybe it is impossible at some level, to closely examine Van Gogh's work and not somehow be an animist. Van Gogh loved nature, but beyond that, it spoke to him. And part of the reason for the art that he did was to give expression to that nonverbal but powerful conversation. Several times in his letters, he says, I wish I could express the intensity of these presences, these natural presences I'm painting. In my house, I have several copies of Van Gogh's work. And, even in the black ink drawings without color, the aliveness comes through. But I'm thinking of the peach trees that he gave us. And there's one in particular that stands facing you like a person. And the presence is so intense, and it's got these beautiful colors, white and pink and blue, and even the ground is radiating. There's such a kinetic intensity to the picture that it's as though the living organism was reaching out to Van Gogh through his eyes and through his other senses, and he managed to capture some of that for us. And so because of him, I can imagine seeing not only peach trees, but a lot of things as more alive, more conversational, more present. In the Starry Night paintings he gave us, there was more than one. In his letters, he talks about how the night sky serves him as a kind of religion. When he was younger, he was religious to the point where he took it pretty far to extremes that bothered his family, who themselves were Christians. That perhaps is another hallmark of his disorder. With bipolar people in a manic phase, they often obsess about something or other. And so maybe that was the case with him. But that dropped away as he got older, and he mentions looking up at the stars as what we would now call a sacred or spiritual experience. And when you look at the stars in his paintings, it's as though they look back at us. And it may be even in those paintings his illness is a background presence, but he alchemizes it in ways that turn what he's looking at into a masterpiece of animistic aliveness, and then gives it to all of us forever. Thank you.